Welcome to Show Studio. We're kind of really getting into the stride with London Fashion Week, and we're going to be talking about Christopher Kane. And obviously Christopher was one of those shows I think everyone really looks forward to, and it happens on a day where there's some sort of quite mighty shows. There's Burberry today, there's also sort of Erdem, so it's a real kind of big day I think for London Fashion Week. And Christopher's an interesting designer because he throws up a lot of interesting topics about what our designers are like at the moment and the way that they're expanding their businesses. So we're going to talk about a few different themes that sort of pertain to his work. One of which will be the key shopping streets that we're seeing in London, because obviously, a matter of weeks ago, Christopher just opened a store on Mount Street, which is kind of a really exciting street for shopping. But we're also seeing some kind of other interesting streets pop up. The news that Dover Street Market is moving is a really exciting one in terms of just planning where's going to be the kind of hot shopping places in London. We're also going to talk about bags, which is not something we discuss a lot on this panel, but I'd like to talk about London and it bags and whether our designers are strong with accessories or not, because it's something that I think New York designers are great at, perhaps London designers less so, but maybe no one will agree with me. And we're also going to talk about investing and the Kering Group's investment in Christopher Kane and who are the sort of young designers who should be brought up by a big group. Anyway, that's my monologue. So before we kick off in discussion about all these different themes and also our review of the Christopher Kane Autumn womenswear collection, I'll let my wonderful and incredibly large panel introduce themselves, starting with you, Rosanna.
Hi, I'm Rosanna Falconer and I'm Communications Director at Matthew Williamson.
Hi, I'm Marion Hume and I'm International Fashion Editor for the Australian Financial Review.
I'm John Michael O'Sullivan, I'm an architect and a writer.
I'm Georgina Goodman, I'm a shoe designer and a lecturer at the London College of Fashion and the Royal College of Art.
I'm Mandi Lennard and I run a fashion consultancy called Mandi's Basement.
I'm Hettie Judah, I'm a writer and editor and I specialise in fashion, art and design.
God, it's very impressive when I hear you all talk about what you do. I'm like, well done everyone, that's great. So I want to start with a discussion of Christopher's new shop, because I think that's a massive, massive step for a designer. Tell me, what does it mean for his business? Is the shop as big a deal as it once was, or with e-retail, is it actually, having a physical space? Does it still mean as much as it always did?
I think for building a brand, I think it's pretty crucial. And I think he's chosen the exact right position. I think Mount Street's a really interesting street. I mean, Marc Jacobs opened on Mount Street in 2007. He's quite a trailblazer anyway when it comes to retail. And there was a real plan for Mount Street, and I remember it being pitched at a lot of different designers. It's going to be an amazing destination, and they had a very specific plan for building that street, and they wouldn't just let anyone come into the street. It was, it's been built over time.
And it's worked really well. You've got a Roxanne store there, you've got Nicholas Kirkwood, Delphina de la Trez has just opened, Christopher Kane.
I think the thing about that street as well, if we're thinking about shops now, as some people say they're turning more into show spaces rather than retail spaces, that area really just exudes luxury. You've got the Connaught Hotel, there's art galleries. Philippe Stupuri has just opened in Berkeley Square. I work close by, so I really do know the area well. And there are great hairdressers. Yeah, there's Mount Street Deli. It has this balance of the kind of place where rich people would go anyway, just to absorb all the cultural and all the luxurious things that one can discover there. But then also I think there's a really nice balance with it having this villagey atmosphere. There's a really great butchers and there are really sweet little cafes, so it's got a great
It's interesting that you say that villagey atmosphere, because do you think that that's part of the appeal, is that it does feel a little quieter than say someone like Bond Street? You can almost kid yourself that you stumbled upon it yourself. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the footfall's certainly lower than Bond Street, but Nicholas Kirkwood said recently in an interview with the New York Times that the conversion rate is very good there, despite footfall.
I mean, the other thing I was going to say is also that area's success shows just how important tourist money is to retail. It's right behind the big strip of hotels, and if you're able to afford to stay on Park Lane, you're going to have the kind of money that's interesting to those kind of labels as well. And it's just right behind the hotels. So it becomes, that street now just become for, top-end retail tourists, the #1 destination.
Yeah, but it's interesting when you say tourists, because it's tourists, as you say, who will spend money. It's not tourists who go to Bond Street to kind of shop as as an activity in the way you'd go see Big Ben and you go see the Victoria Beckham store. And that's quite interesting with Mount Street. It feels like the place you go to buy, whereas I do think we have shopping streets where you go to look. I think Dover Street is one of them, perhaps, where people go and they browse, but they perhaps don't buy.
I agree.
Do you think?
Or they meet.
What do we think about Dover Street Market moving? Because it's going to Haymarket, you know, behind Piccadilly, which is obviously...
I don't think it matters where Dover Street Market is.
Yeah.
I mean, there's Dover Street Market in New York, isn't there? It doesn't. It's almost a brand in and of itself now.
Do we not feel bad for the other people on that street?
For Victoria Beckham just moved in.
I know.
And expecting that really exciting multicultural traffic that Dover Street brings.
I don't think it has footfall. I don't think Dover Street has the footfall. I think Dover Street Market is a destination retail, and I think that. I used to have a shop on Bond Street, and again, you would have thought it was about footfall, but it isn't. It's about getting your customer to come to the store. And people don't just wander down Bond Street, oh, I'm just going to go shopping. No, they don't. They're destined to where they want to go to, and their chauffeur might be waiting outside, or sometimes they might not even be there. They might just have their chauffeur.
I think she would have profited from the people who went deliberately to Dover Street, who then went, oh, and I'll pop into Victoria Beckham.
I think it's a completely different customer.
It's a different customer.
Yeah,
completely.
and I think at the end of the day, she's moved into an elegant street in Mayfair. You know, it's a main artery to get from the main strip to Old Bond Street. She's kind of in the old quarter. And it's a great destination, whether Dover Street's there or not. There's lots of art galleries, and I think that's where she wants to be.
I think it's quite a strange street, actually. Yeah, it's not a particularly elegant street. I don't know. It's
it's a weird street.
It is.
It's
It's
a
quite
weird mix of things in there as well.
I think actually
Unlike
what she's buying by moving into that street is edge, which is something that she completely lacks otherwise.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You know, she's doing really quite bland, mainstream designs, which have no edge at all to them, and she goes in opposite Dover Street Market, and it makes it look cool. And so that's something that she desperately kind of needs that charge. So I'm sure that's why she's there. So without Dover Street Market opposite, she's suddenly next to Whistles.
So if we were advising a brand on where to set up, where would we say? Because the reason I want to talk about this, because I've been watching where people are choosing to place themselves, and I do think it's getting increasingly diverse and really unexpected. You know, Etorts opened their store on Duke Street, which is kind of an interesting choice, and it is becoming sort of another one, I think, like Mount Street, where there's a plan for that street and it's going to become a sort of another retail destination. It's the same with Erdem, opened on South Audley Street. So it's not like, there's only one street you can be on as a designer. Where would we advise people to go?
It feels quite planned now, because obviously, as you're saying, Duke Street is sort of the next, it's kind of happening, but it's almost in the same way Mount Street has been as curated. So Duke Street is menswear, Mount Street is this quite sort of niche luxury, and I think everything that's happening in Jermyn Street, which is allied to the Dover Street move, is going to be a huge growth area, massive redevelopment coming up in a few years' time. So I think it's very much about what the brand is, and more people are going to sort of fall into quite logical groupings. And I guess the downside is what you're not seeing is the unexpectedness of a Dover Street opening on what was a not very elegant street and making a difference. It's the kind of the stuff that you would have expected. Sorry, start that sentence again. It seems in a funny way quite obvious, perhaps, where you might push people to now. And I don't think you're going to see as much of the LNCCs of people just doing exciting risks.
This is also about deals, though, from a business point of view.
Absolutely.
These are buildings where the rents are absolutely in the stratosphere. And so the owners of those buildings want the right tenant facing the street. So it isn't really just about choice. I don't think it's about Victoria Beckham saying, this is where I want to be. It's also about the building that wants to have her. So Mount Street, as you said, has been extremely well planned. I'm sure there's lots of people who've said, I really want to be in here, and they're like, no thanks, we're holding out for...
Well, I mean, actually the funny thing, of course, about Dover Street, before the whole kind of fashion cascade happened, is that all of those Mayfair gallery spaces were relatively much less expensive. For example, Bond Street was, Mount Street now is. And the galleries that made that area kind of slightly offbeat and cooler are being pushed out because the rents has gone absolutely insane. So, I mean, I think it's increasingly difficult in central London to find those areas where the rent is even vaguely accessible to try and create some kind of offbeat shopping experience.
That certainly happened on Bruton Street, where we're based, in which I think probably 10 years ago the same process was happening there. So it was Stella first. Then I think it was us quite soon after. Then there's obviously Kenzo now, there's Temperley now. Bruton Street is...
Got Margiela there.
Yeah, Margiela at the top. And there's a new menswear brand that's just opening at the bottom of the street, I think.
Because, I think Margiela might have been there
first.
Because you see, that was Margiela always used to do that trick. Just like Dover Street, they always used to be
it off.
They were in the old show studio, that's where they were. So when you were trying to explain where
So they were on Bruton Place?
Yeah. Because people would be like, where's show studio? And I'd be like, you know the old Margiela store? And people would be like, oh, that's where you are. So yeah.
Because, internationally, wherever they had their first stores, it was always just like that one, it's like the off note. They'd be one street off where the kind of, the hit shopping street was. So you just had to go for a slight journey, and they didn't have any sign on the outside. But I think...
But you can't really do that now, can you?
Too many people are trying to do it, and I think LNCC had a huge problem, because it's quite a long way to go.
Yeah.
And you see lots of quite confused-looking Japanese tourists looking around.
Bruton Street was never going to be that difficult because it is just off Bond Street. And for us, certainly, a lot of the traffic, it's just because they're on their way from a lunch on Bond Street and a shopping trip on Bond Street and happen to pass. Certainly with the tourists who perhaps haven't discovered the brands on Bruton Street before.
I wonder if a street like Redchurch Street could become more luxury. Because there are a few little signs that it could be. And interesting stores, and I love that street.
I think it's hard being multi-brand, and I think often I do think to make a street cool, you need a single brand's not going to stake a claim and go there. It would be a huge risk. So you need something like a Dover Street or a Hostum.
It's happened a little bit with Club Monaco opening there, actually.
Oh, actually, that's interesting. Yeah. Where would you advise? Because you work with a lot of kind of not just young designers, but really sort of exciting brands where they have got to a point where they've got enough money to look at things like that. What do you advise? Do you still
I think it's this whole thing of destination, because a lot of people are shopping online.
Yeah.
And they still want to go shopping, but they might, do their research online. But in Shoreditch now, the shopping is incredible. I mean, there's so many great stores around there, and again, they're not multi-brands, but they're interesting. And I've just been aware in the past year of not going into the West End like I would do.
That's interesting.
And what you were saying before about Dover Street Market, I would go into town just to go to Dover Street Market. I wouldn't go anywhere else afterwards. I mean, there's nowhere near it for me. And I think there is a lot of destination shopping. And I think South Audley is categorised with Mount Street. That is a little neighbourhood. It's got that lovely neighbourhood feel. But there is a problem there. In a way, Bruton Street is easier, but it's destination, so it doesn't matter that there's not passing trade. But round Mount Street, there isn't passing trade. People are going there for a reason. And also, I think, they're very specific brands. So the person who shops at Christopher Kane might not want to shop at Airdem. I think the customer is quite savvy now. So I think that's what I meant about Victoria Beckham. She's got a location in Mayfair. That's all she needed to have her store, and her customer will go to her store. But is that customer then going to go to Chanel on Bond Street?
But that's what I find interesting about Mount Street, because I do think out of all the streets in London, they've got that sense of, yes, you go there for destination shopping, but you can also kind of style yourself. It's almost like a multi-brand street.
It reminds me a little bit of Westbourne Grove 20 years ago, where you'd go for lunch and then you might go into the shops, that kind of thing. So I don't know whether someone actually trundles around all those stores per se.
But I do think the brands fit together. You can imagine someone wearing Christopher Kane and then wearing Delphina de la Trez, whereas I think you're so right with Dover Street. I don't imagine a woman buying some Acne jeans, popping to Victoria Beckham and buying a handbag, then buying something from Dover Street. You just don't see that. I don't imagine that happening.
And also, I think people nowadays in their shopping habits are so targeted. It's not that thing of, oh, it's a Saturday, go shopping as an activity. I like to think perhaps you do more culturally stimulating things nowadays, perhaps, I don't know, or you just sit there on your phone looking at Instagram. But it's not that same thing of wandering about going to shops anymore. I think people are really, like Mandi was saying, you kind of target Dover Street Market.
And I think they've become like a destination. People are aware that if you get someone into your shop, you have to make them feel as if they'd gone to a museum. It has to become like a cultural activity. I interviewed JW Anderson, he talks about this, because he's obviously doing all the Loewe stores at the moment. There's a big process of trying to, we've got about 150 and they're trying to revamp, redo all of them. And he talks about kind of trying to make them as exciting and as culturally like sort of dynamic as going to a gallery. So he wants like the Rennie Mackintosh chairs in the shops, and kind of almost treating them as a place that you would go to sort of hang out, which is quite a cool idea.
A brand positioning statement.
Exactly.
The store becomes.
Lou, I'm really interested in what you were saying about though walking down a street and popping into each one, because I was thinking, we're obviously talking later in this discussion about these big luxury groups buying up young talent, and I was wondering about all the people owned by the same group on the same strip. Is it just actually going to end up where bits of central London end up almost being effectively a mall for LVMH or a mall for Kering, and you suddenly get this kind of offering of all of their different brands in a similar strip?
I wonder how aware the shopper is of that. I just don't think. I think that's what's been really exciting about Mount Street. Like I can't sing the praises of Roxanda's store enough, because I think if you go into it, you just feel like it's, and obviously Roxanda's owns her own brand, but you go in there and it just feels like its own little world. It's its own thing, and it doesn't feel homogenous, that street, at all. It doesn't feel like one shop's the same as the other, which it is interesting to think about that, but I do wonder, I think if you went into Christopher Kane, you wouldn't...
I don't mean they were homogenous at all, but I guess that it becomes just like that whole strip becomes
that is interesting.
Meaning that if you travel the world, you'd have these...
No, I guess that like one street in central London ends up basically being run by one big group.
Yeah, it's like LVMH Street and then Kering Street. That's quite interesting.
I think
in
the
captain. We talked fashion of a destination, how people don't do it. I would actually disagree. I think they do, but they do it in a different way. And the other retail that we're not looking at is the real shopping mall, which has become so dominant in London. And the biggest mall developer in the world being an Australian company, Westfield, who now have these two poles in London. And there are people, maybe they're not our people, but there are people that go there very much for the shopping that is that wandering in and out of lots of different stores, and perhaps going without the decision already made. Maybe where Mount Street is different is you go there very specifically, you know where you're going. But these big companies like Kering and LVMH are looking to the mall world, and then, as you said, they're dominating.
It's interesting that notion of wandering. I always think about that, because I always think about, I remember going shopping when I was a teenager, and you went shopping to wander around with your friends. You didn't know what you'd buy. But I feel like it's kind of this flip has happened, and this is just my hypothesis, probably incorrect. And I feel like people wander when they online shop. They wander from tab to tab, from site to site, through, look at all these different things. But when they actually shop in a physical way, they know where they're going. They're much more direct. So
except in shopping malls. If you have the experience of being in a Westfield just before Christmas, there's a lot of people wandering. These are not targeted shoppers. This is I would say, well, they're enjoying themselves. It's slightly irritating if you are trying to do something targeted. But that thing, that we all grew up doing, of kind of catching the bus somewhere or catching the train somewhere and going wandering around, still happens, but it's almost like they've been siloed off into these two poles in London now.
I mean, I've been thinking quite a lot about the stores that actually influenced Dover Street Market, which is Kensington Market and Hyper, which we all remember down this end. But what's interesting is that there is no equivalent of that anymore, and although Dover Street is the equivalent of it, it's the equivalent of it with a 0 on the end of the price tag. But that, as a teenager in London, you could go into these places and you did wander around, and you had young designers who were selling things that you could just about maybe save up for. And I think what's quite interesting is that because of the property price in central London, as a young designer, basically there is no in-between. There isn't the equivalent of somewhere like Hyper where you can go and you can have an affordable small shop that's vaguely central that people are going to go to.
Do you not think that's not so much to do with the luxury industry, that's just the way that the high street has kind of eaten up accessible fashion? So
I think these were two very particular things, actually. I mean, I think it was...
I mean, the flip side is that any small design company can afford to have an online website, so they can afford to sell actually that decision about having a shop isn't
that is happening.
The automatic thing anymore. That was what I think is quite interesting about Christopher Kane opening a shop. It's quite I quite like the fact that for a long time he didn't have a website, he didn't have anything, it was just a man making clothes. And to step into this suddenly steps into real estate and steps into taking it up quite sort of substantially, and these things are big investments.
It's so interesting you say a man making clothes, because you're so right. I think there was something, Christopher Kane is a brand, but then you're right, by not being very visible online, not having things like, not having the retail, not having the sort of social media accounts as they didn't for such a long time, it did feel like he was a designer rather than a brand. And this is, I think, a real step to say,
But Kering didn't buy him to be a designer.
Exactly.
These companies operate to build brands. So we're talking about the second biggest luxury group in France. They have taken him on because they can see, in those financial terms, they can see upswing. So this is part of that upswing, that if you have a physical destination, what they find is people shop online and they get very excited online, and then they go and they buy more. So this is the buying more. So it will probably prove to be a very good investment for them.
It legitimises you as a designer if you have a store. And obviously there'll be a retail rollout now. There will be. Over the next 5 years we'll see,
And these handbags have taken off as well.
Well, that moves us to our next point. Mandi. Great. Let's talk about bags. It's really good. I was trying to work out a way to
segue.
Well, because one of the things I wanted to talk about, because I think the bag that Christopher Kane is kind of, he has done brilliant bags in the past, like the jelly clutch bags, which kind of were everywhere. But this safety buckle bag that he's done, which kind of is a hark back to his graduate collection with all those like little seatbelt buckles on the dresses, really is kind of, I think, as close to, and correct me if I'm wrong, for me is as close to a London born it bag as I can think of. And I think, if you look at New York, if you look at designers like Alexander Wang, Perenza Schuler, young brands, they've all had like a hit bag. Like the PS1 is bonkers, the success of that brand. And I just don't think in London our designers produce accessories with that same sort of smash hit vigor. Alexander Wang, his bags are everywhere. They're kind of, I think you see them as much as you would see kind of like a Prada handbag, whereas we just don't have that in London. Why? Or do we? And I'm just getting that wrong.
I think we do now. I mean, sitting in the show, I was thinking, because I knew that this was going to be a topic, so I was thinking, nobody needs another it bag.
Yeah.
So the discussion should be, do we even want this? And his bags today were very, very good, but also because of the seating in the Tate Modern, we were all either first or second row, so everyone had that absolute Instagram access to bags. So people were, photographing there rather than there. So certainly the market that goes to fashion shows likes bags. All the focus was on them.
Yeah, accessories have become, it's interesting, isn't it? I was talking to some buyers about this, just in terms of how people shop and how, you had the it bag for a while, then it kind of became the it coat, because it was just so easy to just cover your outfit with something really great. But now it's like, I feel like it has gone back to accessories. We saw lots of kind of, silly accessories, and I don't necessarily mean that as a criticism, that just became so popular. Shoes that kind of had cartoons on them, and like clutch bags in the shapes of like speech bubble, like stuff like that.
The Anya Hindmarch, she was the lady who sprung to mind for me, and I think what's so exciting is the way they just seem to have taken off, not through a huge advertising campaign like Anya is an international brand, but like European or American brand would have, but just through the power of social media. And their sticker shop, which was obviously debuted on the catwalk in September. They had 3 exclusive stickers that you could buy immediately on Net-a-Porter, which is that brilliant buy it now thing. And then it launched in December on their site. And they're reasonably achievable price points, and they can just decorate anything. And it's been an Instagram sensation. I can't seem to get away from it on the feed.
Is that the Charlotte Stockdale collaboration
as
well? So it's got the added cool
Yeah.
that it's a collaboration with Chaos, which is Charlotte's studio.
Yeah.
And then,
Sorry, no, I was going to say they've actually negotiated the space at retail, because suddenly inside the department stores they've got dedicated Anya Hindmarch, almost like these stores where you buy the stickers and it's all full on.
And it's interesting because it's a very London way of doing accessories in a bag, isn't it?
Making it humorous, making it unusual, very unique.
Because do you think that's part of the problem, is that it doesn't feel that cool to kind of focus on that? I think it makes sense for New York. We think of New York as a very commercial city. I just wonder where that nous came from in New York, that they managed, that so many of the young designers managed to produce a really great accessory, because they're not more talented designers. What is it that made?
They're very commercial though. I mean, the Proenza thing, the CEO of Proenza, I interviewed her a while ago, and she said that the boys sent through this design and she was like, yes. She's like, don't send anything else, this is it. We won't discuss, I don't need 10, I've got one.
Yeah.
And they went to market with that one, it's like a little school satchel.
Yeah.
and it's just
crazy successful, isn't it? When you think, and I think the point where it really took off, also they just weren't. I think for me it was a really interesting turning point in it bags, because they weren't a kind of household name at all. They were still a really niche label.
It's a very difficult name.
Yeah, exactly.
For instance, these two guys whose names are not the name of their brand.
Yeah.
So you have to then explain why they're called that. It's difficult to spell. It's difficult to say, but. Vogue did that work for them.
Vogue did a video this week backstage at their show of filming every single model, and not one model could pronounce the name. Oh my goodness, and I'm not going to be able to now either, yeah.
I just kind of do that thing, like when you can't spell a word, so you just make your handwriting a bit like, I kind of just mumble it. I'm like, it's fine. What was your take on it, Mandi? Because you've worked kind of really closely with a lot of young London designers as they're on their way up, and is accessories something that's on their mind, do you think, or is it just not something we think of?
I think it's production, which is the main sticking point. They just haven't got the production, and they're focusing on getting God knows how many collections out. But when they do a bag, like occasionally when Gareth Pugh has done a bag, everybody buys it, all the retailers buy it, which is surprising, because actually most of the stores, they can't buy odd bags. If you do 3 bags and the buyer buys all 3, they get lost in a there's an area in Selfridges where they have younger designers like Rick Owens and Gareth Pugh and J.W. Anderson, but still there's not the display space to have the accessories too, so it's always a challenge. You have to have a proper collection, and then the accessories buyer gets involved. And that happens on the online luxury market too. Louis Via Roma in Florence, who is huge. I mean, I think it's even bigger than Net-a-Porter. They've got everybody. So when they buy a label, they have to justify the buy, and just 3 bags, it's tricky. So I think the London designers have a real issue with production. And I think that's something that almost the British Fashion Council could be a catalyst to get that going.
Yeah, because do you think it would be...
You could help a few at once.
Yeah, because we talk so much about how the sort of young London brands are going to make sort of their labels sustainable and keep them going. We've obviously talked a fair amount on the panels this season about people dropping off the schedule, obviously because of Medium Kirchhoff, but also Richard Nicol as well.
It's such a cash cow, it really is.
Yeah,
and I remember that show of Luella's it must have been just after 2000. When she did, I mean, it was the first time I'd seen a handbag on the runway when Giselle opened the show with the Giselle bag, and that was a great, well-designed bag. Everyone wanted it, and suddenly you saw a dedicated area in the stores with just Luella's handbags, and it really, really took off. And she wasn't so well known then either.
No,
I mean, at that first New York show, it was a very small audience. Not a lot of people attended it. It was patchy seating.
Because when we talk about it bags, you're right, the Proenza one's a good example. It's kind of, it's anti-it bags, if that makes sense, because the Proenza bag was definitely an anti-it bag, as we talked about. No one really knew who they were. There's not obvious branding on it, but it became an it bag through being an anti-it bag, which, and I feel like that's what we'd expect from London designers. It's to produce something that people would want because it's a bit cool, but it's not.
I think the London designers, everyone would do a bag that reflects their vision. So Christopher's doing bags that are very him, and that's what you get. I don't think they just think, I think they just do what they've got in there, and I think they've all got it in there. They just don't have the manufacturing and also designing. I think when I've worked with designers and I've urged them to do accessories or bags at least, because that is such a cash cow, it really can finance your business and elevate it. Katie Hillier is the go-to person to design your bags, and she's very social. She knows a lot of the designers. So whenever we've asked and said to Katie, would you do the bag, her intention is always she wants to do it, but it's whether she's physically got the time, because she's got her own label. She does Victoria Beckham. She helps, so she was actually really helping. She helped Henry get his bags going. But there aren't many of her. So in a way, when I'm involved in a lot of international fashion competitions, and there are some great British accessories designers now. So in a way, it's matching that talent with these designers, but helping them with production as well.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because that's one of the things I did want to ask, is it felt like as much as we are kind of fashion labels aren't producing the it bags, we have got this amazing set of London accessories talent that's appearing. You've got your Sophia Websters, Sophie Hume, You know, and I'm interested, should we be seeing more partnerships between?
Well, I was thinking of talking to Christopher Suarez actually at Nicholas Kirkwood about it, because they are single-handedly helping so many of the young designers with their footwear collections for their shows, and they're producing and selling them, which is fantastic. But in a way, if someone like Christopher got the handbags off the ground, Nicholas could be doing more handbags. I think he has done handbags, but it would benefit everybody. And it's almost like a catalyst, like someone like him. These are the people that can make it happen.
Absolutely. What's your take on it, Georgina? Because obviously your forte is accessories with your shoes. What makes a great accessory?
I think, but just going back to the smaller designers, they don't have a dedicated accessories team, but I think now what's interesting with Christopher is he will have a completely separate dedicated team, and that elevates the business. And as you said, it's amazing what happens, and he can make his vision manifest, and I think that's when a brand is really born, when they have their bag and they have their shoe, and that makes a really amazing business. I think it's interesting that designers do have a vision of what shoe they want particularly, but they might leave it till quite late in the season to ask someone to make their shoes. So there's always a lot of kind of, and what about the shoes?
No, it's interesting that notion of accessories is an afterthought.
Afterthought, and I think now it's sort of changed. It's become.
Well, I think an interesting one is
serious.
Simone Rocha, isn't she? Because I was thinking about it at her show, because she had a lot of bags in there.
It's taken off incredibly.
Yeah, her shoe was amazing.
And the handbags.
Amazing. But she did a lot of production on the shoe with the perspex heel, because I when I was in Italy, saw it produced, and I was like, oh my god, she did that many? That's really impressive.
Do you think that's what it takes then, just that kind of, I guess, the confidence and also like the resources to just actually like put it all into production? It's like what Mandi was saying, and just
got to get a great sample, you've got to get the samples exactly right, you've got to have a factory that will work, will collaborate with you, because they actually don't know how many pairs they're going to be pushing through to the factory. So a factory will often say, okay, I'll make you this shoe as long as you give me a minimum of 500 pairs. Well, you don't really know what you're going to sell at the beginning of the season. So, and it's very expensive to make a last, to make a shoe. That's why it's better to go to an established designer.
Well, when they've gone to people like Christian Louboutin and Manola Blahnik for shoes, the designer will decide to help them, but actually a lot of them have had to buy the samples. So if they've got, let's say, 20 pairs of shoes, they might get charged just £100 per pair of shoes, but that's a big chunk of the budget when they've got to pay for all the other things, and they're inexperienced on the business side, and they're trying to make a show happen out of nothing. It's really, really tough. But also going back to, we were talking about this earlier, in Venezia, that part of Italy where a lot of the production goes on, they are these really old like 3rd, 5th generation families where there's amazing karma, and they make the shoes for like Margiela, Victor and Rolf, everybody. And again, it's almost like having that relationship. It's almost like having a portal where these young designers can get to that place, and they almost allow a certain minimum that's lower than usual just to help, because I think it's a two-way street.
But I think to make one, to make one construction, you've got to budget €5,000.
Really?
Yes. Make one construction. That means the sizes, all the patterns. That's one style. 5,000. It's a lot of money. So you've got to be sure that you're selling at least 200 to 300 pairs, and then not. It wouldn't be amortized.
Look at Simone's in the stores. I mean, it stands without the collection. It stands as handbags, as shoes. She's really got it
so
on the.
But I think those shoes have always been central to her collections, right from the very first collections she did. And
you could establishing who she was.
Those perspex soled shoes have been absolutely the heart of it.
And they're totally desirable.
Yeah. They squeak like anything. But
I have a pair. They're quite comfy.
I suppose coming back to the fundamental thing of, as you say, with the Puenza things, they shouldn't have been a knit bag, and it's how do you make a knit bag?
Yeah.
For so long it was the massive Louis Vuittons and Gucci's, and as you say, Puenza came along at the right time as a reaction, but you can give it to all the right celebrities, you can have it in all the right places we just don't know. Probably it's just a fluke rather than anything that London doesn't have a knit bag.
Because from, you look at it as a kind of business model, like how can a brand make a knit bag? It's a bit like when people say, I want this video to go viral. It's not actually about what you want. It's about what happens to it when it leaves your hands. And a knit bag is about what happens when it's in other people's hands than yours. And you can give a bag to Alexa Chung, who was being, she's always chased by the paparazzi. But today after Kane, it was like, oh my goodness, this is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But you can get her to carry something because she's carrying something else the next day.
I think
so. It doesn't work anymore. It's very, very difficult, I think.
Which is, if you think of the bags that have done really well, I always think the original bag. I always think of the Chloe Paddington, because I think that just came along at a period where like celebrity culture kind of exploded, and you just think of all those girls carrying it in their arms.
It was so heavy.
Really heavy.
So they all got repetitive strain, which is like my favourite thing. But I think the skill was there. They were obviously gifted that bag, but they all just kept using it every day because there was obviously something really convenient about it. And I think they all said it made them look skinny. There was that big thing about big bag, look skinny, big glasses. But you're right, it's just the right time. That could have been any.
Fendi baguette was,
exactly.
Really was the beginning of the arc, and they didn't predict it. And the name was not theirs. Someone else thought of the name, and it stuck. And so just all those things just have to come together. And there is a kind of magic, isn't there? I mean, Mandi, for all the people that you deal with, you could tell them to do these things, but there's something else has to happen, isn't
I think also, touching on what you said about Fendi, I mean, look at what Fendi's doing now. I mean, they should be the fusty, boring, but actually I think that, they've just got 3 designers, including Rihanna, to do a baguette, a bespoke baguette that was launched in Milan, in New York, and it keeps it really exciting, whereas actually the Proenza Schuler, please move on from that look-alike satchel. I'm bored of it.
Yeah, but that is
who is buying that
how
bag?
quickly
Come on.
things can pop now. Like, I think it because as soon as it becomes big, it kind of becomes outside of fashion. That doesn't seem like a fashion bag anymore.
But they do amazing shoes, but you never see them at retail.
Yeah.
I mean, they do incredible shoes, Proenza.
And you can have all the ingredients, because actually British brand, Mulberry, obviously the Cara bag last year, and all the social campaign behind that, social media campaign from, there was a whole video of Cara going to Somerset, making the bag, and really, I mean, there's one of her even on the sewing machine. And yet I wouldn't classify that 6 months down the line as a knit bag.
No.
And it's interesting because that had the celebrity, it had, it was named, I always find knit bags seem to be named after a girl.
Yeah.
It had all the marketing assets there, the advertising budget there.
And it's
How
it's
do
that
you make
magic
it go
thing.
viral? It is
doesn't
the
happen,
magic ingredient,
The other interesting thing is that I don't think it's happened in the UK or the US yet, but internationally there is a move towards getting set into multi-brand bag stores, which is quite a kind of interesting step.
Oh wow, that's
and
really
that's, I suppose working in architecture, you sort of see these things coming a lot further away. But I guess what that sets up is space for a lot more small brands to get their products into stores, and also perhaps feeds into that thing of people maybe not all wanting the it bag, all wanting the bag that nobody else has. Perhaps that's more where it's going, because there has been that thing of trying to, as you say, react against the ubiquitous thing and just have the only limited edition red, blue, green and yellow, whatever.
Yeah, and I find it interesting as bags as a kind of an exercise of design. I think for a while they were kind of a luxury item, whereas I think it's interesting to look at the Loewe puzzle bag, which is really kind of the intrigue of that bag is the fact that it can kind of fold down flat, and it's much more about design than it is about kind of label or
statement.
Yeah,
Have
exactly.
you seen many people with that bag already?
No, I keep thinking about that.
All
I know they're
over
really
Fashion
trying
Week, it's
hard.
that Anya Heimbach with the stickers on it. Oh, sick of the sight of it.
I know. It's not me. I'd much rather a puzzle bag. Much rather a puzzle bag.
Imagine she did a band-aid in leather that I quite like.
Yeah,
I mean, I like
good.
that. I haven't seen anyone with that yet.
I'm conscious of time, so let's talk a little bit about, because it does kind of tie in when we're talking about things like production and the financial kind of setups of young businesses. Let's talk about investment, because obviously, it was a while back. It was in September 2013 that Kering made the majority investment in Christopher Kane. But I think it is an interesting time for these big conglomerates and their relationships with young designers. But I think it's also, I've thought a lot about it this Fashion Week at some of the mighty brands who I think of as kind of the real pillars of London Fashion Week. A lot of them are funded by sort of individual investors. They're not owned by a big group. Things like Roxanda, things like Mary Trans, Jonathan Saunders just got that big investment as well. what do we think with young designers? Should they be hoping to be bought by a big conglomerate, or is it great to have people like Marion Hume who are kind of owning their own labels? What's the way forward? That's a huge question. It's kind of a huge question.
Want to own their own label. I mean,
do you think so?
Yeah, the ideal arc is to have control. To look at a business like Vivienne Westwood, where she owns her own buildings.
Yeah.
That,
like Rick Owens, I think, is such a good example of that now, just having complete control. It's interesting, isn't it?
But it's very difficult to travel that arc. So, I mean, I'm not for a minute saying if a big investor comes along and it happens to be Kering or LVMH, say no. Yeah. But the ideal thing would be at each stage to grow gently and own a business so that you end up like Manola Blahnik or those kind of businesses. But I think it's very, very difficult to do.
I think with Kering, there's a lot of idea sharing within the company, and I think there's some very clever streamlining of regeneration, and being good to the environment and all those, what do you call it? Sustainability. There you go. And I think that as a group, there's a very healthy exchange of ideas within the company that benefits all the designers. So if Christopher needs things for his designs or his collection that he's planning, there are elements he can take from other areas of the group in a very healthy sharing way, which feels very modern and progressive.
Yeah, there is a materials department and there's a research department, and you are part of a kind of big family, and then there is the production, this massive kind of production, which means your clothes will be delivered on time. And your material will be delivered on time because they own a lot of the manufacturing and the research. It's amazing. That group is an amazing group.
There's a fantastic initiative that they've just started with London College of Fashion. Yes. Is that right?
Yeah.
That is great, amazing. Where when even traditional bags that the group has produced over the years, they're boasting that it's going through much less processes now.
No chrome. There's no chrome in the leather, which is the harmful part of tanning leather.
Yeah.
Actually, I take back the statement I made about this. I meant stay independent because then you don't have the risks that we've seen with other designers. In Fashion Week, we've seen this book come out on Alexander McQueen and John Galliano, and it tracks the difficulties really of if you're one of the kings of fashion, what happens when you make make a pledge to a god, how difficult that can be, and it can be difficult. But if you can have like a businesses that can be supported and grow, and it's small and you own it, wonderful. But if you can join Kering and be part of the it's actually very important. I'm going to get all
other brands are available.
But the sustainability side of Kering, and I actually was not the first one to mention it, so I'm really glad that Mandi is brilliant. And next year they are going to be declaring what's called an EP&L, which is an ethical profit and loss, which may sound dull, but it's actually incredibly important. That instead of saying this is how much it costs to make this bag, it's also measuring things like water and all sorts of things that haven't been taken into accounting and are actually very important.
But that's a completely different way of approaching fashion. That's just, I think it is so important, and that's only going to come if big groups like that start doing it, because you're not going to get young designers being able to think
They've been doing it for ages. They've been doing it for ages, like just quietly, because I used to work in the group, and when it was called something else, but it was still the same system, and there were certain leathers, you go, oh, I love this, you can't use it. Oh, I love
being very transparent about it now, which I really respect about them.
So do we all prepare Kering to LVMH?
I think either way, and I think either way, fashion, particularly, there really seems to be an atmosphere of this here in London for London Fashion Week. There's such a family atmosphere in all the businesses amongst the staff, and so long as think of Christopher and Tammy, and as long as you can keep and have power over the HR side of your business and keep that level of intimacy, and you're not being dictated to by a massive group, no, you need to employ this person. I think that's really important. Maybe it's a very British thing, but I've always felt happier with treating work as a family thing.
I think after what's happened with McQueen and Galliano, there's a lot more sensitivity within the industry now for when these designers come in. Also a lot more trepidation for these houses when they're picking designers about being more sensitive. And we've seen that way, we've discussed it here loads of time about a lot of these top jobbers are going to people that have had the experience now that can deal with you know, the craziness or what suddenly they find them. And I think also when you talk about getting investment from an established company like that, no one ever told you how to do it. You know, so in a way, the expertise that you can benefit from these houses is immense. And I noticed with Christopher particularly that he's doing it, and J.W. Anderson actually, they're doing what they want to be doing. They're not being dictated to.
No, but they just have
they're
the
being
means
very
to do
respected.
it.
Yes, very, very respected.
On that note, should we have a look at the collection, because it is interesting. The reason I wanted to discuss that point last is I think you're right. You do always look, and you can see, you know, each season that they work longer and longer with these, with Kering, with the conglomerates. You do see them kind of just the fabrics step up, and everything looks like there's been a cash injection. Just to give them a bit of a note on this collection, the press release and the show notes talk a lot about the idea of sensuality and this idea of sort of attraction and seduction and the sort of polar opposites and pulls of attraction being something that's very important to it. We're zooming quite fast. Do you mind if we just slow down a little bit? Should I start again from the beginning? Marion, I'm going to go to you first because you were at the show. Tell me, what did it feel like to be there? Tell me about the atmosphere.
It was great, actually. It was great. It was at the Tate Modern, so it's in that beautiful space that's already kind of uplifting and fabulous, and only 2 rows of seats around a very long area, because of course now everyone needs front and second row because everyone's photographing all the time. So it was, you know, planned as a very modern show. It felt to me actually very French, even though it was the last thing I was expecting from Christopher. Actually, it felt very kind of haute and very arch, and it was very good. And the arc of his maturity was there now. It was a great show, actually. I really liked it.
It's interesting that you say maturity. I do think that's interesting. Just thinking about what he's done in the past few seasons, is I think, you know, because I do think of what he does as quite, you know, it's quite youthful. It's always quite sort of a little bit subversive and very sensual and quite cheeky. But I think his work more and more feels very grown up and very sophisticated. And a lot of that comes through in the palette and the fabrications. What's your take so far on what we're seeing, Hettie? You look very...
Well, no, I was just thinking, I always have trouble seeing it. But I was actually thinking about last season when we were talking about the fabrications, because some of the pieces he pulled out of the hat on that one were just so beautifully constructed. All those kind of floating components with just things flooding out of them, and you're starting to see, you know, when you've got those incredibly sheer fabrics being enmeshed into something that's much more structured like that, it's technically really difficult to pull off. To get it just sitting like it's one fluid piece. And it's funny, I've seen a lot of people actually doing roughly similar things where they're trying to bond 2 different weights of fabric into something like that in a skirt, and most of them look absolutely terrible. I mean, this season I've seen a few of them, and they just can't get it right. It's really hard to get it.
But he's so good.
And it looks really effortless when you're looking at that.
Clashing opposing elements, you're right. I think he's really, really strong at.
I remember when I was I used to work at the British Fashion Council, and Sarah Moore, ambassador for emerging talent, and so integral to Kane's career, particularly at the start. And she'd say that every show you sat down and the first look would come out, and it was a real jolt to the senses. Might make you feel a little bit sick when you saw the first one, because it was such a subversion. And I find that less and less now in the last few years. It's beginning, I don't know if we're getting used to the jolt to the senses, but this feels like a continuation from spring summer, and recognisable as a Kane collection.
Less seasonal.
Yeah.
I do think that's the case. But I also think one of my favourite things to do, this is just a personal thing for me, his collections always really grow on me. I never love them when I first see them, and then I always love them afterwards. And I think they're really, really smart, because they're never like too obvious. You know, there's always something that comes out of them that everyone wears and becomes like the Kane thing from that season that's really identifiable. But it's actually sometimes quite hard to work out what it is when you see it on the runway. And then it's like, you know, the bin bag stuff that he did. When you actually saw that runway, I didn't jump out at me immediately, and then looking back, that's
I loved that straight away.
No, I did love it, but I wouldn't have straight away gone, oh, the bin bag collection. Whereas now I'd call it the bin bag collection. I think it's the same with this. You're not looking at this and going, that's going to be the thing that everyone's going to wear.
Although funny enough, I'm looking at those 16 and 17, and having seen the Autumn show today, the baby doll dresses and the Victorian blouses, and that it's kind of funny how there's a shape coming through this season for various things.
But I think I like the way Christopher Kane, because I do think he's a very sexy designer. We don't have a lot of sexy designers in London, but he always plays with stuff that's also quite like fussy, like those sweaters that he did that were kind of everywhere, that were like really quite ugly but great, like really high neck and big frills, and I think he's very good at kind of playing with that.
That 18 is an amazing colour palette. Look at that.
Yeah.
He's talked about a nightlife colour palette. That's the way he's defined it.
Yeah, with these electric blues.
Yeah.
Felt very kind of
it's like
disco.
looking out of a hotel window.
Ending with disco, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was into the shop this morning, and it was interesting. It's a white shop, which there haven't been many white shops for a while. But you were talking about the fabrications, and it is a bit like the Beckham shop, that things are displayed in a very gallery way. Everything is very spaced, and that is what jumps out. It is partly the colour palette, but you really do get drawn into each individual thing, sort of texture and sort of finish. And I guess that's really, he's been taking quite a long process to get that shop there, and that's really how he's sort of getting the message across. And you can see it. I hadn't thought of it
actually in the show itself, but these clothes have hanger appeal,
Yeah,
which his clothes don't usually. Of course, now he's got a shop. He's thinking.
Yeah, you would be thinking about that. I think you're right. His clothes, I think, have always worked really well as images, whereas now, obviously, they have to work well on a hanger as a physical object. That's really interesting.
And I guess then they're less dependent on those really bold graphics.
Yeah.
As you were saying, those really bold colour clashes.
Yeah. No, I think his collections have definitely got more subtle, but then maybe that is just a process of kind of developing. And I think he's in a much safer position now. I don't think you wouldn't feel that. I think obviously, he works incredibly hard and does amazing collections each season, but I don't think you'd feel that same pressure to like court press through surprise. It's interesting. Do you like what you're seeing, Mandi?
Very much. I think the colours are really strong, and I love the red handbags too.
And it's also a lot of handbags, which goes back to our discussion.
And Lou, is that an it coat for you, or is that a dress?
Exactly, an it coat.
It's
like a coat dress. Best of both worlds.
But a handbag in every hand.
Yeah, exactly.
Very much, so yes, the it bag question is answered.
Yeah,
exactly.
And that will be the merchandising team.
Yeah.
That'll be the business arm.
Yeah.
You know the minimums for these handbags.
Yeah, whacking them all on. I do think it's interesting to talk about the palette though, because I don't know, maybe this is just my impression. I love how people have such different impressions of different designers' sort of codes, but I don't think of him that much in terms of colour. I do obviously the neon, but I also, when I think of the neon, I think about it more in terms of texture. For me, he's a texture designer, not a colour designer, whereas actually thinking about the last few seasons, he has established himself as such an amazing colourist. Those beautiful purples that he did were so beautiful, and these colours are amazing, really, really interesting.
I think he's also interestingly ahead of the curve with colour. When he started bringing burgundy out, it was just absolutely. I mean, it was 2 years ago, and he did the one with all the botanical things.
Yeah.
And I got that strong kind of sense of burgundy off that, and it was quite ew.
Yeah.
And then suddenly burgundy starts coming everywhere, and by the time he's doing it in the last one, it looks quite comfortable.
Yeah. No, you're right, and it's interesting just with that red that he, that bright red, and the bright blue. They're kind of offbeat colours in terms of. You don't see them that much.
They were there in the couture shows, though, a lot of
bright
tangerine and red, a lot of primary colours.
Well, that is very true.
And they're quite old school colours in some ways, if you think, because they are, for some reason I keep thinking about old YSL shows. When I see the reds and the blues, and
Eve
it's
Klein,
that kind of really...
Yeah, it felt
Eve
very
Klein.
YSL.
I love we've got Georgina and John Michael sitting next to each other.
Everyone got a tip
And
on.
nail varnish.
It's interesting also to think, because I think, whenever I do research about Christopher Kane, a lot of the old cuts talk about him as like the king of the party dress, and I feel like he's really moved on from that as well. It's really strange when you read that. It kind of stopped suddenly around like 2012, probably people just stopped talking about him like that. But he is really great at dresses, but I think it's interesting to see, a lot of the suits that he does, and I think he's become really, really great at like coats and skirts, just kind of expanded his repertoire. And I think there are other designers now that you think of more as the party dress candidates.
But I suppose that's the young celebrity thing, isn't it? You know, who the party dress for the young celebrity would have been Christopher Kane.
Yeah.
And he's growing up, you know.
I don't think of him that much as a celebrity designer.
Not a celebrity designer, but a young celebrity. What would they,
exactly.
I think if you're someone who's got your eye on Christopher Kane and you aspire to the brand, you aspire to having a dress.
Yeah.
No, if you're a regular customer who's buying it, you might buy a trouser suit, but I think if you want to get into the brand, you want a dress. I think I'd say that probably about most of those designers.
Yeah, that's very true. Maybe the dress is London's version of the bag. Like you want a great party dress.
Yeah. Or this number 41 here, that's your Instagram hit, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think if you're all about your social media, that's what you're going to want.
What's on it?
It's bodies intertwined. There's more coming up.
Yeah, it's very.
That's why I know.
Oh, that one's amazing.
It is really, really sexy as a collection. Just even like 40, you know, it's more subtle, but just kind of. I like the way it's kind of gathered. It almost looks, you know, when you're like dancing or you're moving, the way the fabric moves. It's kind of doing that on her. I think that's quite sexy.
It's in 42 like a Marilyn Monroe pin-up like that, and then you've got your head sticking out the top. It's like a kind of background thing.
But it's quite.
It doesn't sound great when you describe it, does it?
No, but it's quite extraordinary.
But I like that because that is kind of the old school, like kind of almost bad taste Christopher Kane, where it's kind of like jarring. It is jarring. You look at it
exactly.
and it's like a kind of.
But it's now sort of jarring bad taste, but beautifully constructed, and you'll see when some of the later.
But it's interesting when we looked at 41 that we weren't quite sure what it was, because that shows that if you wore it out of the context of a show, you know, people would be like, oh, what is that? Is that a flower? Is that a? And then you get up close and they're like, oh, I see.
And there are press releases as you go.
Yeah.
But though we were kind of talking when they were coming through, but all of those iridescent velvet things, I mean, you could really so easily, I mean, that's difficult stuff to work with and make look kind of classy and
But he's so good with velvet, isn't he? When you think about, you know, the dresses he did with all the interlinking, like the faggoting that he had on them, where it was all kind of
Tudor inspired ones.
Yeah, that was amazing, and it looks so modern when it should have looked really fussy and old. I think he's really, really good with velvet. I want to see more of these naked figures. It's so exciting.
The writhing body dresses.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like the kiss. But it is interesting also, I think I thought about it as soon as I read the show notes, but actually before I'd looked at the collection, and just how unfashionable kind of sex has become in fashion. You know, it's just like, I think it's kind of, it's almost like a taboo now to be like, oh, I want to look sexy. You know, it's so, everything's about kind of being minimal and nonchalant. And I was thinking about it actually a lot even when you look at the way that fashionistas dress at the shows, it's so kind of like, not even androgynous, but so sort of removed from any sense of like showing off your body or looking sexy. And I think that's almost, it's interesting to see him champion that, because it feels like quite an antiquated idea. You know, brands that are all about making women look sexy just don't feel, it doesn't feel like a fashion idea.
You need another word for sexy.
Yeah, you do.
Sexy is one of those words like trendy.
Yeah.
It's a bit like overt, you know, having bums and tits. I mean, in a way, these are a modern interpretation of sexy, because they're kind of, it's how you move in them.
But it's interesting to see him champion it as an idea when you do. I just think it's so removed from fashion. You know, this idea of appealing to a man, it feels so outdated.
Did he just literally have that collection on a cardigan, which would really underscore everything that you just said?
Lovely.
Yes, it's a cardigan.
I feel like there should be more coming. Is that the last look?
Okay, maybe there is some.
Did he end the collection on a cardigan?
Can you do a hard refresh, Levin?
I didn't notice it was a cardigan.
I think there might be somebody behind, but
I think there's someone coming.
Was that actually in the show, that one?
I've got to say, I didn't remember that final look.
Yeah, I think we're just getting the order.
It's not a strong final look.
I think sometimes these can create a bar of things, so you don't always get them exactly.
I thought the body dresses ended it, but then maybe I was concentrating on them, and one
maybe
just
there was just
out.
a rogue cardigan that appeared on the. We'll get it in a second.
The other merchandiser.
I think we've also got to bear in mind fashion's interpretation of sexy as opposed to a man's interpretation of sexy, because we've picked up, I've noticed on a lot of looks, saying how the way the fabric moves, for example, or I think a lot of men would still find that man repeller blog material and quite scary. But I mean, I don't want to diminish men to saying they're all simple. They're certainly not simple in their taste, but I think there's always, it's even if the fashion industry find the term sexy difficult, I find often when the term is used, it's actually quite misplaced. Our version of it isn't.
It's interesting that it's like
the general interpretation,
because it's not. I mean, there are things on there that are talking about sex I don't know if it's necessarily about whether it's sexy or not, in the sense of attractiveness, but it's just making, it's a bit like the Richard Nicol, when you had all those kind of images all over, I think it was last winter, it's kind of just bringing the topic out almost, and kind of, again, I think in menswear that highlighted how kind of staid a lot of London menswear is. And again, this is just kind of putting it on there.
I think also in the show notes when he talks about sensuality, if you were wearing that velvet dress, people would touch you. Yeah. That is sexy. Yeah. You know, that's sexy both ways.
But that's what I think, that's what I was saying with the kind of the way it moves. I do think, you know, I have it with this skirt. This is a Christopher Kane skirt, and it's kind of like pretty ugly because it's a bin bag, but people touch it when you wear it. You know, we had Edward Enninful in the studio earlier, and yes, he's a stylist, so he likes clothes. But the first thing he did is like touch it. Yeah. People are like, what is that made from? And I think, you know, Christopher Kane's such a tactile designer. You want to kind of go, what's that made out of, and touch it. And I think it's interesting because as much as the looks with the writhing bodies on them are very sensual, you know, even it goes back to what you were saying, Hettie, the looks that kind of paired different fabrics together, they're just as kind of sensual because you do want to understand how it works, and it kind of looks like two things merged together. And like the bodies, I think, are the most literal interpretation of it, but it's the same idea as putting two fabrics mixed together that are opposing. It's a really interesting notion.
And also makes people want to look at you and look at your body, and I think that's, and then it gives people permission to look at you, and I think that's really interesting.
But also look at your body in a more kind of developed way than just like, oh, look at her figure. It's more like actually look at your body.
No, if you're wearing something tight, people look away. You know, it's like, oh, I better not look.
Yeah.
I love these bits of see-through in them because some of them have just got little tiny kind of. Yeah,
there's a cardi.
Right, you didn't intend to.
Yeah, it was just rogue at the end.
But there's this kind of gradation in that first dozen looks. There's a gradation of transparency. So you get ones which just have a kind of keyhole, and then ones that are much more bold. Like, you know, 11's quite bold, but there are ones earlier on where it's just kind of, you know, bits of, like this one here. So you've got kind of bits of clavicle kind of coming down,
and yet the coats are quite prim. The thing over the top is quite prim, which is very French.
But I think that's what's so fetishy about what he does, is how he always combines stuff that's really prim with stuff that's really, really sensual. Like number 4 and 5, they almost could be, you know, like if you did see a woman wearing that's quite a conservative shape, and the colours are even relatively, you know, it's red and blue and black. They're not kind of particularly bonkers colours. Then you look at it and you can see that it's kind of kissing faces when I look now, but when I first saw that, it just looks like kind of a nice blown out pattern.
And worn with leather gloves.
Yeah, that's quite sexy.
As opposed to Lady Gaga at the Oscars.
Yeah, what was that? That was so strange. It's like you could use them as a handbag. So what is the closing look? Can we go to the end? Just because we had the rogue cardigan, I want to see what actually finished off.
I think it is the dress of the entwined figures, isn't it? But I think it's also that thing about primary colours, that just being the kind of, you know, it's like designing with Lego, and so actually that is something really bold to do.
Also, they're quite carnal colours, aren't they? If you think about it, like, you know, that bright blue and the red and the pink. They're not particularly offbeat or subtle, which makes sense for a collection that's about kind of sensuality and.
I wonder whether he saw the Matisse cutouts show.
That was what I was thinking, looking at it. But the press release says that he got the whole of the studio to design.
To do life drawing.
To do life drawing, yeah.
I wonder if the studio went to the Matisse cutouts. Yeah. Because that's what that feels like, isn't it?
The life drawing is the sketches, though, the illustrations that we saw.
Yeah, yeah.
But especially sitting in the Tate, seeing these things that they did feel very
in that
Matisse,
context.
but then what a great thing to be inspired by.
Yeah. But I wonder, you know, Matisse, I think, has inspired so many designers. You always think with Christopher Kane it's like something even more.
But it's just looking at those cutouts close up when you actually went to the exhibition, it was a real shock seeing how tailored they were, and they weren't all just done in a one. You know, they were kind of hundreds of pieces intricately stuck together to create that thing, which I think is going to chime much more with somebody that's used to creating something in a pattern and you know, creating a body out of small pieces.
I'm very conscious of time, so as we look through the close-ups, what's our takeaway from this collection? It seems like it's given us lots of food for thought. It's not what I was expecting from him. I think last season, you know, the palette is very different to what he's been building on, I think. And it's just, it's incredibly beautiful, but it is also, you know, it's much more, just really different to what I was expecting. What's everyone else's take?
It's very slick, I'd say.
Yeah.
It's going to look good in his shop.
Yeah, that's very true.
It's very watchable in a weird way.
It's quite mesmerising, isn't it? Yeah.
There's a real narrative. It develops beautifully.
I also think I think it's just because we had that really long conversation about accessories and shops. I just keep looking at it like with a merchandising hat on. You think how well you could empty out a shop and take this straight off the runway and kind of lay it out, and you'd look like you had such a diverse offering and such a mature offering as a designer. You know, if you had the shoes and the bags and all the amazing separates and then those amazing dresses. You know, I think it's really, really great as a collection. Well, shall we give him a round of applause?
Definitely.